Welcome to Connecticut in Motion. Today's show, the impact of COVID-19 on current workplace trends and commuting.
Good afternoon. I'm Dennis House. Thanks so much for joining us today for Connecticut in Motion, where we'll explore the future of Connecticut's transportation system and the issues facing today's commuter on the road and in the workplace. This series is a production of CT Rides, a program of the Connecticut Department of Transportation that helps to find commuting solutions for today's workforce. So whether you work at home, the office, or both, CT Rides will show you the way. Today, we'll address the ongoing impact of COVID-19 on current workplace trends and commuting. Before we meet today's panelists, let's thank our sponsors, shall we? Thanks to our media sponsors, media partners, Hartford Business Journal and New Haven Biz. And thank you as well to today's event partners, Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce, the Northwest Connecticut Chamber of Commerce, the Waterbury Regional Chamber of Commerce, the Middlesex County Chamber of Commerce, and the Metro Hartford Alliance, CBIA, and CT SHRM. Today, we'll be addressing the ongoing impact of COVID-19 on these workplace trends and commuting we've been talking about. And with us today to discuss these trends, we have three experts. Kelly Bacon is the Global Practice Lead of Workplace Advisory at AECOM. That's an international infrastructure and workplace consulting firm. Kelly has partnered with Fordham University on adapting the innovative predictive analytics of retail and consumer industries to corporate workplaces. She has consulted for a wide spectrum of clients on the federal level, including the Department of Agriculture and Indian Affairs, and private clients and consumer goods giants, Bristol Myers, Estee Lauder, and locally in Connecticut for Collins Aerospace. Kelly, welcome to you. Thanks for being with us.
It's great to be here.
Also with us, Lauren Mason, who's a senior principal for the career practice at Mercer. Lauren is also a solutions leader within Mercer's talent practice, focusing on driving innovation in and around flexible working and employee experience. She's a frequent speaker and author on flexible working and has recently had press mentions in CNN, HR Executive, and the Society for Human Resource Management, that's pronounced SHRM. At Mercer, she focuses, among other areas, on employee experience and flexible work. Lauren, thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And from the Connecticut Department of Transportation, we welcome Kim Lesay, who is the Bureau Chief, Policy and Planning. Kim has over 26 years of experience in the transportation industry, spanning both state and private sector service. Before serving as Bureau Chief, Kim was the Assistant Director of Environmental Planning and was responsible for overseeing natural resource planning, permitting, construction compliance, and air quality documentation. Kim holds a degree in ecology and evolutionary biology from UConn. Kim, good to see you here.
Thank you so much, Dennis.
Good to have you with us. So working from home or telecommuting has been growing in popularity over the past decade, but COVID-19 really has supercharged this trend as employers require their non-essential employees to work from home full-time to comply with state requirements until it's safe to return to the workplace. This shift, which has gone over, for over a year now, has demonstrated the benefits and practicality of telecommuting, and will have long-term impacts on employees' work expectations. This first segment today will explore this phenomenon and the work situation and commuting, both in the short and the long term. To start us off, I'd like to turn to Kelly. And Kelly, what are your expectations for return to work for employees in the future workplace? When we talked previously, you had said that this was the number one question in everyone's mind, employer and employee alike. And I know that so many have not come back yet, and some are thinking about doing so. Kelly?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. It is something that everyone is talking about, whether on the individual level, your own personal experience with remote working, to the organizational level in terms of how organizations are going to craft their new normal. So really, kind of two primary things happened this past year that I believe have enabled this the potential new future. There's the obvious, as you said, Dennis, folks being required to work remote, and organizations really needing to invest in the infrastructure in many cases to make it a viable means of getting their work done. So the investment, the necessity, and then the third element that happens is that the stigma of remote working has been lifted. A lot of organizations and agencies have realized that it is now viable and it's a viable option. So now as we start to think about what that post-COVID future looks like, organizations, private and public alike, are now having that conversation as to what is the right balance of in-office and remote working for our organization.
Thank you, Kelly. So the future workplace isn't really about brick and mortar. Let's ask Lauren to weigh in here. Lauren, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a topic that was really even top of mind for employers prior to the pandemic because there was so much feedback from employees saying this is something they were looking for. So we surveyed HR leaders, at the end of 2019, and 90% said this is something that they were looking into during 2020. But certainly, with the pandemic, that has accelerated the size and pace of adoption because most have, experienced it. And as Kelly mentioned, they found that it works. Over 90% of employers say that productivity has not declined. And actually 1 in 4 say that employee productivity has improved. And similarly, when employers look at employee engagement, 80% say it's the same or better than it was prior to the pandemic. And that's despite many of the economic challenges that employers were facing. So certainly employers are looking to continue this flexible working into the future and looking at ways they can, retain many of the benefits that they've experienced during the pandemic, but balance that with the benefits of in-person collaboration.
Lauren, thanks. Just last month, Raytheon, a major defense contractor, of course, formerly United Technologies, with a large footprint here in our state, announced they could shrink their office by 25%. So the question is, will employers continue to offer remote working as we move past the pandemic, or will we see a return to the office? What do you think, Lauren?
It's a little bit of both. So certainly employers are looking to get employees back to the office. On a recent survey we conducted at Mercer, over 60% of employers nationally said that they hope to have half or more of their workforce back by the end of Q3. 70% of employers say that they will embrace a hybrid model with employees flexing between remote and being in the office. And of course, many employers have a wide variety of roles. So even in a hybrid model, you'll see different working patterns. So across about 400 employers that we surveyed, we found that about 40% of their workforces will be on site. Nearly half will operate in this hybrid model with an average of 2 to 3 days remote, and about 10 to 15% will operate, on a full-time remote basis. But certainly, this transition isn't going to happen overnight. We are still in the pandemic. Employers still have concerns around social distancing and capacity. So this is something that we'll see phased in over time.
So, Lauren, how does this impact employers regardless of their size? Is the industry a factor, whatever they're in?
Absolutely, industry does play a factor. We see industries that have large frontline workforces, such as retail, entertainment, hospitality, manufacturing. Those type of industries do tend to desire to lean in a little bit less on remote working, given that they have a large presence on site. However, we do see these sizable shifts compared to pre-COVID across all industries. But certainly, as we talked about earlier, employees are likely to force the hands of even the most skeptical of employers because we continue to hear just how important this is to employees. Office staff tends to have a transferable skill set across industries, so employers will certainly have, attraction and retention concerns to consider when they're designing what these new programs will look like.
Kim, what are you seeing on Connecticut's transportation system at this point? Like, what are the current commuting practices like as we begin to move out of this pandemic?
Dennis, we're certainly seeing differences across different modes. So it depends which mode you look at. If you look at our roadways, folks might have actually noticed our volumes on our roadways are actually pretty much back to pre-pandemic levels.
Yes.
But they look a little different, right? You don't necessarily see those peaks in the AM or the PM that we all used to dread a little bit. But the volumes themselves are back. When it comes to transit, when it comes to our bus ridership, we did see quite the dip. But right now we're at about almost 70% of folks that were utilizing that service still utilizing it, which makes sense because folks that use bus oftentimes don't have another choice as far as their mode of how to get to work or even to get to the grocery store or to get to medical care or to classes. And then we really saw a different story on the rail side. Where folks are really using rail, for the most part for commuting. And that's where we saw the most drastic drop-offs last year. And those riders are returning. We're at about 25% ridership compared to where we were. And those riders are coming back slowly.
So what kind of differences are you seeing? What kind of behavior changes on the roadways as part of these impacts? I know that some people say that people are driving faster, more recklessly. What are you noticing?
Unfortunately, Dennis, we are actually noticing quite a bit of that. We've been gathering data on that, and it's really disturbing. Despite the fact that our traffic volumes have been down considerably, last year we actually had 59 more fatalities across the state than compared to 2019. We had a really horrible spike in April where we had the lowest VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled, that we track. And also our highest fatality rate. We're seeing dramatic increases in speeding, as you noticed.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
Yeah, and March through May of 2020, we have some data. We actually saw a significant increase in the number of folks who are traveling in excess of 15 miles per hour over the speed limit. So excessive speeding. And that's of course very concerning, and one can make some guesses that there's some correlations there with those fatalities. We're not alone in Connecticut in seeing that. We are seeing that nationwide. The National Safety Council reported that motor vehicle related deaths in 2020 were the highest they've been in 13 years, despite the decrease in miles driven. So these are very disturbing trends that we're seeing.
I'd like to move on to our next segment about redefining the workplace. Kim, thank you so much for that. And we'll get back to you a little bit later. Employers will have to decide how to adapt to the expectations of their employees, that they will have a greater access to flexible work arrangements. Many people want this. The workplace will need to reflect these changes in terms of space allocations, the type of office environment, and purposeful presence demands. It is likely that if many employees will be working 1 or 2 days a week at home, office space requirements are likely to change. Ultimately, these changes will impact employee behavior and commuting. If employers adapt to employees' new expectations, what will the workplace look like, and what will this mean for how employees work? We've heard so much about changes in space allocations. This new office environment will need to make the requirements also for health and safety, and also while fostering collaboration in a corporate culture. So Kelly, I want to begin with you. What kind of changes do you think we'll be seeing? I know we've heard these stories about these expensive offices in Manhattan being empty, that they don't need them anymore. What else are you seeing?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. And I want to go back to something that Lauren mentioned in some of her previous comments. A lot of these organizations have realized the efficacy of remote working. Again, the stigma has been lifted, investments have been made to allow it as a viable option. So as Lauren shared, that we have seen a lot of research in terms of the effectiveness and the efficiency of it. But one of the things that we have realized through our survey research and work with our clients is that the things that have been suffering, the things that haven't been going as well, is what you just mentioned, Dennis, the camaraderie, the corporate culture, and things like mentorship, traditional and or reverse mentorship. So as we survey about looking at the future, and we survey organizations about what is it that's drawing you back, and or as organizations are making targets, just as you said, to reduce 20%, 30%. We're working with one organization that is looking at a pretty drastic 50% that we're not yet sure if it's viable. But we start doing research in terms of what are the activities that you are going to be doing in the office, because we're no longer assuming it's the place that people go to do all things that they have to do any given day. So really, in terms of the fundamentals of kind of the kit of parts, if you will, or the typical space types, those aren't likely to change too much, but the allocations of them will. Meaning, we're likely to start allocating and dedicating more space to collaboration areas, training areas, small group meeting areas, and less dedicated to individual, one-to-one ratios, which is what we call, workstation and office per person, because that just takes up quite a bit of space. But obviously, in order for that to be effective, you have to have the proper technology in place. You also have to make sure, and this is one of the things that we want to make sure from a DEI perspective, that we're not overlooking the folks that may not necessarily have the appropriate conditions to continue working from home, whether it's a roommate situation or a family situation or shared space, what have you. We do need to make sure we're still creating and providing those spaces for people to do focused work, individualized work, etc. So as Lauren said before, it's not a one size fits all. It's very much a bespoke um, solution to what an organization does and how they behave and their industry and client focus.
Lauren, I want to get your insight on this. What do you have to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I would just echo Kelly's comments. Employers are really looking at, how are we defining the role of the office? And as Kelly mentioned, being really intentional about what work gets done there versus what can be done remotely. So for example, one client we're working with define the role of the office as create, collaborate, and celebrate, and really driving that message about what type of work gets done in the office versus what type of work gets done remotely. And that, as Kelly mentioned, will allow that space to free up for different types of activity that you want to foster more of around collaboration, connection, and so forth. But the other factor here that we're hearing from many employers is, in the near term, we're still in a pandemic, and so many of the benefits of the office that employers are looking to bring employees back for will still take time before those can be realized. And also just from a behavioral perspective, we've all become very much ingrained in remote working. And there was some recent data from the American Psychological Association that found that half of Americans said that they were uneasy about adjusting to in-person interactions once the pandemic ends. And that held true even amongst those people who were vaccinated. So certainly, this transition is something that's going to take time. Employers need to be thoughtful about employees' concerns, particularly in the near term, given the broader environment that we're in. And so for that reason, we are hearing many employers say that they'll phase in that return over time. So while employees may in the long term be expected to be in the office 3 or 4 days a week, in the near term, they might be looking at perhaps 1 or 2 days just to get that transition started.
All right, thank you, Lauren. Kim, if employers are setting up their work sites to have their employees coming in a few days a week, what is the impact on the roadways and transit? How will transit respond to these changes? For example, will current transit schedules work if these commuting hours are spread out? Will congestion be a problem? What are you all planning for? I noticed that there have been some changes to the Hartford line, for example. I think as of today, I believe that they're changing the hours a little bit to reflect more people commuting.
Thanks for that question, Dennis. So as far as our bus ridership, I'll touch on that really quickly first. We kept at our regular levels throughout the pandemic for numerous reasons. As you noted, we did decrease train service because we were seeing such low ridership. And right now we're at about 2/3 of operating on our different rail lines, and we're keeping an eye on that. For transit and rail, we could pivot relatively quickly to meet demands. Our roadways is a big question, right? So you would think it would be obvious that if people are only working a couple days a week, that we would see much lighter volumes. However, as we discussed, we already are seeing volumes kind of back to normal, just with some different patterns. What's really going to matter is some of the issues that Lauren touched on, which is how comfortable are people being back in the office, but also using public transportation. We did a survey back in July of last year, and a lot of folks really felt uncomfortable about sharing that space, or back then had the concerns about cleaning, back when we thought that this could come from hard surface contact. So it's going to be interesting to see, will people switch modes? Will they get into their cars? If they do, our roads could be just as congested as they were before. So it's really going to be up to how folks behave as they return to work.
Thank you, Kim. Let's turn to a macro issue, demographics. We've heard that people have been moving out of the metro areas to live in safer and less congested places during COVID-19. This pandemic has definitely had some impact on demographic shifts, even here in Connecticut. We've talked about the red hot real estate market, how many New Yorkers are moving here and so forth. As more employees find it possible to work from home, locational decisions about where to work and live may have changed. Are we seeing this as a new phenomenon, and is it here to stay? What does this mean for the workplace? What does it mean for our transportation system? Kelly, let's begin with you here.
That's also a great question. And we've been hearing quite a bit of anecdotal evidence about these mass exodus out of these major metropolitan areas. So much so that even, in the fall through the winter, we were saying it as well, because everywhere you read, articles, et cetera, talking about it. However, as we dug deeper and realized in the U.S. specifically, the only cities where we've seen these moves be are New York City and San Francisco proper. And those moves are really specific. Connecticut is and will continue to be a beneficiary of this movement as more and more are moving into the Connecticut area. And just as you mentioned, Dennis, that the housing market is really being impacted. So too is location strategies for these big organizations as they start to think about their portfolio as a whole. But one of the things, so it's not going to be something that's going to happen overnight. Anything that's location strategy portfolio wide, it's kind of looked at and evaluated lease by lease, site by site. But one of the things to kind of tack on to what Kimberly was saying, that one of the additional shifts that I believe that we're going to continue to need to maneuver is this new flexibility we're talking about is also about, in addition to it being how many days a week will you be going in, we've also seen this broader kind of the shift away from the 9 to 5, meaning as it relates to transportation, that the peak hours may be less apparent, and commuting may happen throughout the day as organizations embrace flexibility, not just with how many days a week you're in, but also when you're actually in the office. It's going to become, and has already become, more socially acceptable to maybe start your day from home, come in the afternoon, or vice versa, and structure your time in the office, as Lauren said, for purposeful interactions, not just because this is when our day starts.
Thank you, Lauren. What would you say are the demographic trends impacted by COVID-19? And is this likely to affect the workplace practices of employers and employees?
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider how policies that employers are putting in place will impact that mobility. As I mentioned earlier, in the near term, most organizations are looking at that hybrid model. The majority of employees will be, in the office and working remotely throughout the week, but there's still that expectation for employees to be in the office. So, because employees may not be required every day, they may be willing to trade off a longer commute, but they're still going to be expected to be within a commutable distance so that they can be in the office on a regular basis.
Okay.
As I mentioned earlier, there's about 10 to 15% of the workforce that can be fully remote. And so there may be some mobility enabled by that. But, this concept of work from anywhere is really not a reality that will play out in most organizations. And that's because there are tax and legal implications for an employer based on where an employee is working. Unless the employer has operations in all 50 states, they're likely to put requirements on employees on where they can work so that they don't have to deal with the legal complexities and tax implications of working in other areas. So many of my clients are putting in policies in place to say that employees can work in states that have, where they already have pre-existing operations.
And Kim, I'd like you to weigh in on this too, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been some really interesting points brought up here, and especially Kelly touched on one of them. Taking a step back, demographics certainly play a role in our planning process and what we look at long term. However, we don't want to be too premature, to try to pivot for things that may not stick with us as a society. When you think about how people travel and when they need to travel, it's not just for the commute to work. Many people are e-shopping that never were before. Will that stick around even if we stay home or go back to work? There's many different behaviors that we're seeing out there, even down to the fact that a lot of folks don't feel comfortable putting their children on the school bus, and so they're driving to drop their kids off at work or at school in the morning. But Kelly touched on an interesting point, and in fact, nationwide, our trips that are under a mile not only are back, but they're higher than the 2019 numbers, which makes sense, right? So folks don't have that chance to do what we call pass-by trips, which is, on the way home from work, I'll stop and get milk, I'll stop and get what we need. So now instead they have to take a separate trip out to do that. So it's all going to be about seeing what behavior sticks around and us adjusting to the needs of the traveling public.
Excellent. We have time for a couple of more questions. Is there an employer policy on employee vaccination, and how does it impact the workplace? Kim or Lauren, either of you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one. And this is certainly a dynamic situation. But when we surveyed employers earlier this year, very few, practically none, were planning to mandate vaccines. And today that's very much still largely the case. But however, there's something to monitor here, and that's that we are starting to see some movement in the university sector towards requiring vaccines for faculty, staff, and students in the fall. So locally here in Connecticut, there was, the example with Yale, who announced that they will require vaccines for students in the fall and evaluating that for faculty as well. And so, there's suspicion as we continue to see this movement in the university sector, and that we'll also see some movement in the hospital sector as well. And the other factor to watch here is that, as vaccine makers will likely look to apply for FDA approval now that they've got the full 6 months of data required. And if that is granted, we anticipate that may opt employers to look into more of mandates around vaccines. So, again, it's a very fluid situation, not a lot of activity on that today, but certainly something that a lot of employers are watching as we move forward.
Are there geopolitical parameters at play in terms of employees coming back to the workplace? For example, hesitancy to be vaccinated, or conversely, hesitancy to come back to a workplace based on where someone lives or works?
As Lauren said, it's a fluid situation. It's very difficult to write policy around it, given there's an element of psychological safety involved. So that's why you're seeing a lot of organizations that are setting targets in terms of our workforce will be back by Q3, Q4, et cetera. But a lot of companies are putting in a safeguard, which is at your discretion or at your comfort level. Because again, most organizations, and with very few exception, are not mandating anybody come back because of the variability and the opinion and diverse opinions around vaccines and comfort levels. So it is a tricky situation to navigate right now.
I want to bring in Kelly, Lauren, and Kim just for some final thoughts, some takeaways. Begin with you, Kim.
This is a challenging time for us, but it's also an opportunity to take a fresh look at what the demands might be and how we can best meet them. We're looking forward to another survey in conjunction with CT Rides this summer, and it'll be interesting to see how people react and what they say their intentions are as far as how they intend to travel.
Lauren?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Again, this is something that's really important to employees. Nearly 60% of employees said they'll consider switching. Employers of flexibility is not an option. And, as the data is showing, many employers are looking at embracing that. So employers will want to make sure their practices are competitive. But I think, the other thing to consider is that, flexibility is not just about remote working. So keeping in mind that, 40% of the workforce or so that is required to be on site, and think about flexible options for them as well. Kelly mentioned, time-based flexibility throughout the day. All of those are important to consider so that you can provide, flexible options to the entire workforce and not just those who can work remotely.
And how about you, Kelly?
Sure. I think my final thoughts are more about the idea that we're currently in an evolution, not a revolution, as it relates to remote working, and recognizing this past year has been extreme circumstances. We've had to respond as a society. Organizations have realized the efficacy of remote working. As Lauren shared, employees and individuals have realized the positive benefits of it, the work-life balance, et cetera. But location strategy, redesigning a portfolio, it's on a site-by-site, lease-by-lease basis. And there's going to be a lot of experimentation, a lot of pilot programs. That's one of the things we're doing with a lot of our clients, is helping them structure and test and model the future in a controlled way so that we can, learn the lessons and apply them across the broader portfolio. So as much as this past year, everything changed overnight, in terms of the longer term implications of this, it is going to be an evolution of change.
Dennis, I'd just like to add that these are really challenging times, and yet the DOT team is really ready to respond. This is an issue that we talk about on a weekly basis, on a regular basis, and leadership is keeping a pulse as best we can on any information we can get a hold of, and we're ready to follow through and stay committed to all of our traveling public, no matter what mode they take, and respond as necessary to serve them the best we can.
Thank you to everyone for your time today and for tuning in to this edition of Connecticut in Motion. Stay tuned for future segments of Connecticut in Motion that will continue to cover subjects such as workplace sustainability practices and productivity post-COVID-19. On behalf of CT Rides, thank you to today's guests, Kim Lesay of the Connecticut Department of Transportation, Lauren Mason from Mercer, and Kelly Bacon from AECOM. I'm Dennis House on behalf of CT Rides and the Connecticut Department of Transportation. Let's keep our state moving forward, moving ahead. Have a great day, everybody.